Welcome to the Shun podcast, where we expose religions that use shunning as a tool to control people. Today we have a fascinating interview with someone that was raised in a racist family cult. It was a very small cult, just 14 people or so in actuality, but the teachings of the leader were found online, and they attracted a lot of alt-right and neo-Nazi supporters that were drawn to it. This is a look into the literal life cycle of a cult. Yeah, you're going to see how a cult begins, how this one in particular eventually came to an end, but how even the beliefs still linger, which is the power of a cult. Those beliefs are still there. Now, last month's episode really shined a light on the narcissism present in Jehovah's Witnesses, but this episode is going to show how one narcissist, it only takes one narcissist can impact so many people's lives. And it shows how narcissism breeds narcissism among a group. We're not going to be using this guest's name. She picked a letter to go by, so we'll call her V. I will also not be releasing the name of the cult or the website that was used. We live in a world right now that is more concerned with hunting people down based on what a person said years ago than they are looking at who a person is now. My guest has been impacted in this current climate, where employment can be impacted simply based on affiliation with a thing at one point in a person's life, simply because they were raised in it, or maybe that's just the way they were raised, or they didn't know better, or whatever. I think as the Bible says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I'm not down with outrage culture, and I'm not here to promote it or to cause problems for people. This person is being very brave in telling their story, and they should be rewarded for it, not penalized. So stick around after the interview, and you're going to hear how the podcast is doing, what next month's episode will be about, and I'm going to give you some highlights from the Shun Podcast Facebook group and what's going on there. So without further ado, let's meet V.
My name is V. I'm 26 years old. I was born into a small family cult, and I have shunned people I love.
All right, V. So then how did you come to be in that family cult in the first place?
Well, it goes back quite a ways. I was born into it. I'm the youngest, fifth. I'm fifth of six kids, and my mom and her sister were very close, and my sister met the man who would eventually become the cult leader, and they got married, and he had always been an extremely polarizing person, very narcissistic and set in his ways, which was attractive to my aunt, who'd lived with mental illness and anxiety and panic, and his very strong, I can do everything, I can fix everything attitude was comforting, I think, to her. And a few years before I was born, my parents' marriage really started unraveling, and my mom's long-held fear and anxiety around religion and safety really kind of hit her pretty hard. And my uncle was promising that he had this new way of believing, and he understood the gospel in the way no one else did, and he could make sure her kids were saved, and he knew all the ways. And looking back, it's pretty clear that none of those claims were things that he could follow through on. But for my mom, who was in a marriage that wasn't particularly easy and who had a lot of unprocessed trauma from her childhood, those claims seemed so comforting. And originally, she accepted the beliefs for a little while. My dad did not. And then they were actually shunned by my uncle and my aunt for about 2 years over some money and other disputes. My uncle really enjoyed the power of cutting people out of his life, and he used it often. But after that time, my mom just felt so lost. She started going alone to the meetings, and it was just the three of them. But that rapidly grew. And when I was 4, my dad was excommunicated. There were a lot of reasons why he was excommunicated. All the men in my family were excommunicated, and I think that that's what the the leader used to kind of control us, and also people who spoke up against him got kicked out. But after I was 4, that's when the cult really started shutting down. We got kicked out of our last traditional church by my uncle standing up and calling out the pastor in a very awful way, looking back at it. He would literally stand up in sermons and tell the pastor he was wrong and he was preaching evil things. And so obviously we didn't make it through churches, but as a 6-year-old, we moved away from the little country house that we had. We had acreage, we had a pool, it was wonderful, but it was just too much for my mom. And really moving into town, and having my dad be no longer a part of our lives except for through court-ordered visitation really started closing everything down, especially because when my dad was excommunicated, he sued my mom for custody of us kids. And every single person that she knew sided with my dad because they knew my uncle and they knew how oppressive he was, and they were worried about us. And so my mom lost all of her friends and her husband and her church and everything that was outside of the cult. And that was when we really it closed down for all of us in a pretty intense way.
So when you say it closed down, what does that mean?
So that means we were taught, for example, we had to go to visitation with my dad, but we were taught we couldn't say I love you to him. We couldn't trust him for anything. He was evil.
So he didn't win custody then?
He did not win custody. No, my mom won custody, and he won visitation rights every other weekend with the 3 youngest kids, which was another complicated factor because the 3 oldest chose not to go with him, and that kind of caused a chasm in the family a little bit. But it closed down in that we were, instead of going to church and then maybe having a cult meeting, we started having cult meetings on Sunday and Thursday. Our beliefs got more crazy. And we were taught, it's interesting because I grew up in a neighborhood with lots of kids. I was not isolated physically, but spiritually and emotionally, we were taught that we were responsible for other people's choices. And we had to there were all these rules around friendship and around trusting people. And we were taught that the quote unquote real Christian church, or the mainstream Christian church, was evil, and Calvinism was the biggest issue because we believed in conditional salvation. Anything with unconditional salvation meant they were evil. So when I say closed down, I just mean that as a young person, I was taught to not trust anyone except for the 14 people in the cult with me, which, as you can imagine, is very isolating.
I have to say, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go.
Oh, I just wanted to say this is really fascinating because what you have here is the nexus of a cult. It's a look into how it all starts, and you've got your aunts. It's amazing how people that are kind of ruled by fear naturally or anxiety seem to find these people who are the total polar opposite, who are narcissistic and who are completely sure of themselves in a way that they doubt nothing about themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then you just see how the narcissist gains power because he, unfortunately, a lot of times it is a he, seems to attract people who are scared. And then what he does is he rules through fear. Fear is his tool.
It absolutely was. And I had an interesting talk with my mom recently too, who said, looking back at her life, she can see that she acted primarily due to fear for most of her life. And it makes sense. She had a pretty unstable childhood. And then this man comes, into her life, and she was faced with the option of either she follows him and listens to him, or she loses her sister and her mother, who were, because they were pretty inseparable. My aunt was very sick from very early on, and my grandmother was very close to her because of that and because of my aunt's mental illness. And so my mom, even before there was a proper cult, she faced shunning and loss, and for someone who's scared and needs direction, it makes perfect sense why we ended up there.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And one of the things I've noticed, well, first of all, you have the power of shunning that
Yeah,
was even there, right from the beginning because your mom was,
immediately.
yeah, immediately. And then you have um just the attraction of people who are hurt to these
Yep,
people that supposedly have all
can
the
fix it.
answers. Yeah, yeah,
That's
and
exactly right.
it's so sad because these are people who need help the most. I even in my own family, from what I understand, there may have been some trauma that attracted my parents.
Yeah,
In doing these interviews over and over again, you find that there's trauma somewhere in there that has made the mom or the dad vulnerable, and
yep,
they've gone toward this thing. And then once you're in it, it's so hard to ever get out of. It's just a vortex that just
it
keeps you
is.
sucked in. I Wow, I'm just really sorry for your mom that she, you
I
know,
know. Well, and the
had all
difficult
that.
thing too was that she married a man who, while I love him dearly, he's the youngest of three in a very wealthy California family. He's never had to work. He's never had to really like fight for things.
Yeah,
And so when my mom joined the cult, he didn't know how to fight for us and how to help us. And he knew we were in a cult, but he didn't know what to do.
yeah.
And so when he got excommunicated, it was obviously just completely devastating for him. But as the person that he was, I don't think he was ever equipped to save us out of that kind of situation. And I know some of my siblings have felt really angry with him, and I've had moments of it, for not doing more to save us, but I don't know what he could have done. He was completely excommunicated. We were all taught from, I mean, my little brother was 2 when he got excommunicated. So we were taught almost from birth that he was evil and bad. And it's just crazy how the personalities of people and the things in their past can really like affect them for so long, like
Oh yeah.
just such a long period of time. And the other thing too about my dad is that his parents were just blissfully married. They had a wonderful relationship, and he went into marriage thinking that it would be like that. And it was not with my mom. They just were not, it was not a good fit from what I've heard. And obviously, I was very little when they divorced. And so I don't have a lot of clear memories of what their marriage was like. But from hearing from both of them, there was just always this imbalance that was just magnified when my mom went to the the cult leader, her brother-in-law, and started listening to him exclusively.
Oh, I can only imagine how much that must have driven a wedge in there. I mean, that's
Yeah,
that's yeah, very strange.
yeah,
And I feel for your dad because I would assume he probably lives with a lot of regret,
yeah.
and he was simply just put in a position he was not equipped for, and then
Mhm.
like you said, you're taught from the time you're 2 to think that he's evil.
Yep.
There's like, even if he could have fought for you all, and even if he could have gotten custody, he couldn't necessarily change your mind.
No, he couldn't have, and it's interesting looking back, a lot of my siblings still have really complicated feelings about him. But within the last year, I've been able to come back because we were out of contact for years and years
Yeah,
after visitation ended. But I reached out to him and I was like, I can only imagine what it would be like to have this family that you love, 6 kids, a wife, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And that was how it was for my dad, is that he lost his whole family
yeah.
within a small period of time, and it was partially due to his own mental illness. He went through a severe depressive episode, had some suicidal ideation and an attempt, and he was cut out partly due to that. And knowing that his own mental illness was, it was not only treated with disgust, but it was also given a moral weight. And that
Yeah.
on its own is devastating. But then to realize you lose everything you love and this dream that he's had since he was a tiny kid of having a loving marriage and like all of these things, he lost so much. And I understand how he reacted the way that he did and why he kind of curled up in on himself as opposed to trying to keep fighting for us, because it was a losing battle. I mean, it really was.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think he did the absolute best he could have done in the circumstances. And, it just sucks.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's not something you're trained on how to deal with,
No.
in any normal life. And then, it's just so it is complicated because, and I can understand, you're also where your siblings, have that complication because on one
Yeah.
hand, they're hurt,
Yeah, of course
and
they are.
and unfortunately, um, our emotions and our feelings, and then our mind, our intellect don't always sync up, and so
Yep.
it's easy to feel hurt on one hand, but at the same time you can rationalize having compassion for this person because clearly he was just overwhelmed and overmatched,
Yes.
and he probably was doing the best that he could, but I mean it sounds like he had his own issues, and we often forget that adults have problems too.
They absolutely do. And I think it's been interesting for me getting back in touch with him and realizing that, I mean, his side of the story is so incredibly different from the side I was
Sure.
told that, I mean, I know that we were taught to think black and white. So it's hard
Oh
for
yeah.
me still to remember that, like, his perspective is his perspective, and that doesn't make it wrong just because it doesn't line up with my mom's at all.
Right.
Um, and that's been really interesting too, is learning like where he was coming from. And we were really taught to fear him for a lot of really unfair reasons. Um, like he had some intrusive thoughts involving self-harm and potentially harming my mom, and he took care of it. I mean, it was a mental thing. It was an intrusive thought, something you can't control. But we were taught that he like was violent and hurt my mom, and none of that happened.
Oh.
And so it's been really interesting, like approaching my dad with like an open heart as far as like what was your experience. And I think it's been especially difficult for my siblings because he's still really gun shy about all of us, which I don't blame him for. And so I'm the only one talking to him at the moment. He's not comfortable moving forward with other siblings yet. And that's been pretty painful for them, and I feel for them, and it's been really hard. One of them asked me to stop talking to him, because basically to shun him, um like just within the last few months, because he's talking to me and not everyone else. And I understood the impulse, but at the same time, like I want to give him a place to finally kind of maybe get some of his family back.
Right.
And that's not going to happen if I bring all these rules and laws to it. I
Oh,
feel like I'm getting
absolutely.
really off track. Am
No,
I
no, no.
doing
That's
okay?
okay. That's no, no, no. This is great.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get back to to the childhood and everything. I think this is important though, because
Yeah.
it does show,
Well,
you know,
provides context.
yeah, it's context. It's that perspective as well. Needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
And taken into context. And this is all really a part of how the brainwashing of a cult,
Yep.
makes you see things the black and white ways, and
All or
discounting
nothing.
others' experiences and
Yep.
things like that. So then,
Yeah.
okay, what was the um? So your family has split up. You're with your mom now, and
Yes.
you're. Is it all sisters, or did you have brothers as well?
So I have two brothers,
Okay.
one on each end, and there's four girls in the middle. I'm the
Okay.
youngest of four. My oldest brother left the cult when I was 12 and committed suicide when I was 18,
Oh, I'm sorry.
which is an incredibly difficult thing to go into. I'm learning to come to terms with it, but his suicide was used as yet another fear tactic to keep us
Oh,
in the cult,
yeah.
because that old verse, the wages of sin are death, was applied to him, and like if you leave you're going to die too, over and over and over. And it was just really awful because we were never allowed to grieve our brother. I mean, he was my big brother and I loved him so much.
Sure.
And we he was dead to us basically, and he had to be, and it was awful. um and so, but as far as the makeup of the cult after my dad left, the cult leader's brother joined shortly thereafter, and he had he has 2 daughters and a son. So the main body of the cult was that family. So there's 5 of them, and then my family, and there were 7 of us, and then the cult leader and his wife, and then my grandmother on my mom's side. My mom also had obviously a father and a brother, but the father was estranged even before the cult happened. He was fairly abusive, emotionally and physically, and caused a lot of trauma to my aunt and my grandmother and my mom. And then my mom had a brother who, by all accounts, now was an amazing man and exactly the kind of dad that I would have wanted to have had, or like person in my life.
Right.
But they were excommunicated because they questioned the belief system.
Right.
They made the mistake of saying that what he was teaching wasn't biblical, because it wasn't. And so we were taught to be afraid of them, and that they were evil, and that they were like wicked Calvinists. And so we were really restricted to this very small group of people. And we had to think all the same way and believe all the same stuff. And it was just a very claustrophobic environment.
Sure. So then what was the worldview that you were given by the cults?
Well, it's funny because there were 2 different things. I mean, the cult leader specifically would say one thing and then act another way.
Right.
But I grew up believing I was a Christian, and that I was practicing Christianity in the way that we were taught, back in like the New Testament, where everyone's in home churches. I had a whole spiel about people, because people would often ask me if I was in a cult when I mentioned what I did for religion. So much so that I had a complete spiel about how we're not a cult, we are a home church, like the Bible, it's wonderful. You want to come? Like blah, 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 blah. But the basic worldview was salvation is conditional and love is conditional. If you make any mistake, you have to repent or you're going to hell. It was kind of like if in the big book of life that's talked about in Revelation, if there was an eraser on the end so your name would be written, and then you make a mistake, like argue with your sister, and you're out of the book of life.
Yep.
And it because of that, I remember constantly feeling like there was a big cliff behind me, and I was running away from it, but it was following me. And if I stopped for even a second, I would fall in, go to hell, and never be saved. And that was just that in itself was pretty a lot of insecurity. And then couple that with the strong disgust and distrust that the cult leader had towards all other Christians. The idea was that we were the only Christians that had this unique truth. We understood the whole truth, which was conditional salvation, the idea that it's not once saved, always saved. It's a continual choice. That was very much wrapped up in some incredibly anti-Semitic beliefs regarding Israel, which basically he went back to the idea that God made a covenant with Israel. They were kicked out of Palestine for their disobedience. And then when they came back in 1948, that was against the conditions of the covenant. That's why they're evil. That's why there's problems in the Middle East. And it was always couched, of course, in like, but we love the Jews and we don't blame everybody. But that kind of really intense anti-Semitism does not get detangled from hate, even if you're trying to say that you have a loving mission towards them. It was really like everything was blamed on the Jews. It's really awful looking back. They didn't believe that the Holocaust was what happened. And on the same token, as you would imagine, was also extremely homophobic and racist. My uncle would go spend the meetings that we had were anywhere from 2 to 5 hours twice a week. So we were sitting there just listening to all of his opinions. And one of his opinions that was really strong was that I think it's Daniel. There's a prophecy about how like the different races or different kinds of material. It's very complicated, and I don't know how much of it's actually biblical, but basically the idea that because of the way Abraham's sons sinned, Black people are being punished forever, and they're like the lowest of the low. And then, interestingly enough, Jews are the highest, but we're the true Jews because we are we've accepted Jesus. Like, it was this very complicated, convoluted thing that basically led to Black people, all their faults are because they're Black, they're evil. You should never muddy the races by getting married to them. Just like all this really insidious stuff. And the cult leader had a pretty, I mean, not a huge internet following, but he had an internet following. And they were almost all of the like neo-Nazi, alt-right people that appreciated this idea of like, white man is best, do not muddy the races, like all of this incredibly problematic stuff that we're seeing so much of in our culture today, and how much it really does separate and divide us. And being taught that from a young age, and to feel any guilt, feel so much guilt if you like have a friend who's Black or have a friend who's gay, or have a, God forbid, you have a crush on someone who's Black. Like,
yeah, probably even just having a kind thought about someone of another race or sexuality, was
sexuality
enough.
For sure.
Yeah.
The thing is that there were things, it was very contradictory, because we did have a Black man who joined the group for a while.
Really?
And he was eventually kicked out because he had the audacity of wanting to date and marry one of my sisters.
Right.
But it was weird because there was so much doublespeak. I don't know if you've read 1984 by George Orwell.
Amazing book. Anyone listening needs to read 1984.
It's honestly one of my favorite books, because a lot of the tactics described were used, like the idea of saying one thing and doing another, doublespeak. The idea of like having two ideas that are completely contradicting each other, but like I can be friends with this Black person, but at the same time I believe they're the lowest of the low. Like, it was a very weird, uncomfortable, unstable way to think.
Well, yeah, and so this Black man joins this cult that thinks that he is evil. So I mean, just think about not just double speak, but the cognitive dissonance that one would have to have
exactly
to join something that is self-hating.
It's pretty crazy to think about, especially to think about. I have always been a very I make friends really easily. I'm very introverted, but I'm really good at pretending to be extroverted.
Oh yeah, I understand.
So I brought many people to the cult meetings, and there were a few times where I brought someone who one girl that I brought was bisexual, and the poor thing just ended up getting yelled at for an hour and a half by the people there about how wrong that was and evil, and like she never came back, and I'm really glad she didn't. I feel endlessly guilty about.
Well, how did they know she was bisexual?
It came up somehow.
Oh,
I don't remember. I don't remember how it happened.
I mean, it sounds like a pretty intimidating environment.
It was. See, we public reproof sessions, basically just public "you're an evil person, you should die" sessions, were really common. And if I remember right, what happened with that was just that she was very clearly not a conservative Christian.
Yeah.
And so they started calling her out for that. And then she, I think, stood up for herself and for what she believed in. And then they just got more and more awful. That was about a decade ago. But it was really interesting to see how on one hand we're like, practice like faith will save you and give grace to others. And on the other hand, we're taught that if you hear a friend or see a friend or do anything slightly wrong, like for example, a friend had a tattoo, like they got a tattoo as a Christian, which I'm perfectly fine with now, by the way.
Right. Yeah.
But she ended up getting excommunicated by us for that, because the idea was that if you saw someone doing something wrong and you didn't call them out for it, that you would be culpable if they went to hell. And that comes from a very misinterpreted chapter in Ezekiel that talks about the watchers on the wall, that you're responsible to call out and like warn the city if there are marauders coming or whatever. And if you don't, then it's your fault. And so that was
I understand that. I mean, there's a whole lot of that kind of stuff in the Bible.
There is. And the problem is when that's taken and twisted and applied to every
little thing.
Area. And I think a really good example of this is when I was 6. We had just moved into the new house in the neighborhood. The neighborhood was great. There were like 35 kids under the age of 15. So we had a lot of people around us. And the first girl I met was my next door neighbor, and she was 4. And we became really close friends. But that was around the same time that the cult got really intense. So I was sitting in cult meetings being taught that, for example, Halloween's really evil. All modern day church pastors are bad and they're preaching the wrong thing, like all these really intense beliefs, while being told that I need to tell people that. So my poor little neighbor, we're over hanging out. I think it's October, and she's talking about Halloween and she's really excited. So I go off on her about how Halloween is of the devil and her pastor is bad and her mom got remarried, so that means she's evil too. And I left thinking, wow, like I helped that little girl. I saved her life, like all these things. Because I'm a 7-year-old and I was precocious and that's what I thought I should do. And her dad came over and was just, of course, livid because this poor little girl gets told that all these things that are important to her are evil.
Yes.
And so the dad, who I loved, he's a policeman and he was just like the coolest man. And I looked up to him and he just like got so mad, and my mom was really mad at me. And I was really confused because I'm like, I did exactly what I was taught.
Right.
And my mother ended up getting publicly reproved the next day in the cult meeting because the cult leader said that what I did was perfectly right and my mom shouldn't be afraid of man and all this stuff. But that little incident in my childhood really shaped how I moved forward. And it also was some of the first time I had doubts. I mean, I was little and I was like, this does not seem normal to me. This does not seem right. Like I'm just trying to help my friend and I'm getting yelled at for it. And then my mom's getting yelled at. And it was just, but this idea that we were meant to be like judging other people based on very, very superficial ideas was really pervasive and caused a lot of problems throughout my life.
Well, sure. I mean, a narcissist is the perfect judge and jury and executioner, know, and then basically all he's doing is teaching you to be a narcissist, to do the same.
But only in his specific way.
Well, yeah. I mean, come on. We have to have standards.
Yes.
And he gets to set them.
Yep. Well, because he hears from God.
Yeah. Well, yes, of course.
That was another piece of it, was this idea that the Holy Spirit speaks directly to us. Granted, he was the only one that really heard him. But that idea that like the Holy Spirit and God are going to guide us and direct us through like basically verbal ideas,
right.
Was especially one of the most, I think, detrimental beliefs that really, I mean, because in the name of that, you can be racist and you can be all these other things.
Of course.
And you can cause all sorts of pain because the Holy Spirit led you and it's just for your good.
Yeah. And I mean, let's face it. Usually when people hear voices, that's a sign of mental illness. That's not a sign of God speaking to anyone.
Yes.
I mean, we help those people. We don't put them up on a pedestal typically.
Typically.
At least in secular society, and I know we don't know anything, but so then what was childhood like? I mean, because obviously you had these 2 meetings a week and they were very long, harsh, it sounds, almost rants from this narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
What was childhood like at home? Did you have to study a lot for these meetings? I mean, it sounds like it was kind of winged, but I mean, were there things you had to do?
Things. So kind of, we were homeschooled, so we were home all the time.
Of course, yes.
Yes. And throughout the week, there weren't huge expectations of us. It got more intense around the holidays. We were required to give testimonies every year, and that was always really hard because there were like 5, because it was Easter, Thanksgiving, so I guess 3, Christmas. I feel like there were more, but that was really when we had to like study But
Okay.
and then also there were a few times where we did offshoot cult meetings, like there was a youth meeting for a while, and that was much more intense. We had to like study and be prepared for that. But childhood mostly for me was just, I mean, I remember a lot of really wonderful moments, and I think that comes from I started to read when I was 3 and I never really stopped. And I kind of grew up in books in a way, and that really protected me a lot from a lot of the more difficult experiences that my siblings may not have had the same protection from. Um, I I have a very vivid imagination, and I've always been an artist and been creative. And so a lot of my childhood, I think back on those moments and how even during some of the worst cult meetings where I was unknowingly self-harming or doing other tools to get through it, um, I was often able to escape into my
Yeah.
own world.
Yeah.
And that protected me so much. And also helped me kind of like stand on my own 2 feet, especially, for example, against the racist idea. I never stood for that. Like that just never felt correct to me. Um, and so I was really able to hold on to a few of my own ideas, I think largely because I did have my own safe world. Like I had like an imagined room that I could go to that was safe, and like all these tools that I used, I didn't know were tools back then, but they were what protected me, I think, in a large way. And
Yeah. It was an
um,
escape.
it was very much of an escape, and it was an escape no one could dictate. Um, I mean, my mother could dictate the kind of books I got, so could the cult leader,
Right.
but I could still escape. And so I mean, there are lots of things looking back that I did have a very happy childhood. I had people who loved me. I always had playmates, and especially for my little brother and I, we played Legos constantly, and we were in a neighborhood, so we could run out and play tag with kids. Um, it just got more complicated as I got older and was expected to like be more of an advocate for the cult. And
Right.
when my brother left when I was 12, everything really changed then. As you can imagine, I remember that day. I I was doing what I usually did, which was in lieu of taking notes like everyone else did, I was drawing in my notebook because that always helped me. I was always drawing something. Still to this day, always drawing something.
Mm-hmm.
And my brother, there was this huge confrontation, but I wasn't really paying attention because it seemed like just another public reproof. But at the end of it, my
Yeah.
brother walked out and we never saw him again. And that for me kicked off a pretty intensive period of not understanding why we had to suffer so much, not understanding why God would call us to do this. My mom would cry every day, and I couldn't understand why she had to go through this and why I couldn't love my brother anymore. And so I think before 12, even with visitation and all the other stuff, it was pretty idyllic and in some ways. But after that, that's when
It got
my
real.
eating it got real and my eating disorder began, and a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
early signs of my OCD and anxiety and depression started. Um, and I almost left around that time period. Well, I almost got kicked out.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, so I was 14 and I'd been just struggling for the last couple years. And I knew that if I left, I would be shunned and I'd be excommunicated, but it was starting to feel like a possibility. And I went to my first ever summer camp. I met a boy, and I started seeing what life could be like outside the cult.
Yeah.
And I just still didn't understand why Christians why we had to fear other Christians so much. And so I basically told my mom that like I don't understand why we're living this life. I don't think it's worth it. And that called for a huge Bible study where they spent like 5 hours yelling at me and freaking out on me for a very normal teenage statement, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
um,
Very
and
innocuous.
the cult leader finally like made me pray this specific prayer, and I was supposed to be all better. But in the morning, I woke up and I remember just now I can look back. I'm like, that was depression.
Yeah.
But just this very dark, heavy sadness because nothing was different. And I
Yeah.
felt the same way. And so I went and told my mom. And of course, that to her, she's like, oh no, you're being self willed. This is evil. I'm going to send you to your dad's house. And she literally sent me downstairs to pack up my room to move to my dad's house. And you have to remember that my dad was someone that we were taught to be afraid of and be scared of, and that he
Right.
was violent. And my brother, of course, had similar narratives pushed on him after he left. Um, and so me leaving would have meant losing everything I knew, um, and becoming like my dad, which we were taught he was this selfish, evil, awful person, and that if you leave, that's what happens to you. Um, and I remember I had this little rag rug in my basement, and I was sitting on it, and I was crying and crying and crying, and I was about ready to pack up. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do this. And then the fear of everything hit me so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, it felt like waking up and finding a gun in your hand pointed towards your head. Like, it was like, I can't do this.
Right.
I can't go through what it means to be shunned. And I often look back at that, especially since my brother died, and I could have potentially had some years with him before he died. And I regret being scared away, but at the same time, I was 14. I was very young.
Yeah.
And this was all I'd known my whole life. And I told that story for years as it was my Christian salvation story, because that's what it was to me at the time. It
Sure,
was
of
like,
course. Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
choose Jesus instead of my dad, basically,
Right.
which is a choice no one should ever have to make, in my opinion.
Right. But
Certainly
that was
isn't something
your big stand.
that
Yeah.
was, and
That
I
they
had,
forced you into.
they really did. And for weeks after that, I was mocked, and I was like told that I wasn't behaving the right way and that no one could trust me again. The cult leader called me out in front of everyone and was like, "You put on such a good show. How do we not know you're pretending now?" And I just remember feeling this like deep-seated peace about it. And I think that's because I gave up my doubts that day. I really, really did. I was like, okay, it's this way or it's out, and I can't be out. So I've got to be all in. And um obviously there were a lot of times when I questioned it later, but that
Yeah.
I closed the door so hard on leaving. And then just a couple years later, when my brother committed suicide, it was used as a way to like back up that choice. Like, good
Right.
for you. If you'd left, you'd be dead too.
Oh gosh.
So basically my childhood was it's pretty split in my mind of like my brother left and after my brother left.
Right.
And also and that decision too really changed things.
Wow, there's just so much. There is so much here that I want to say.
Go ahead.
It's there's just so many parallels. It's fascinating to me how many parallels there are, in this small family cult and then what you see in larger cults. I mean,
Yes.
what you talked about as far as like having an eating disorder, anxiety, OCD, all those things are about control.
Yep.
And when you grow up in a situation where you have no control over anything,
yes,
where your thoughts are controlled, your feelings are controlled, everything is controlled by fear, and you start to seek control in any way that you can get it.
Yes.
And you don't even know you're doing it,
No, you don't.
It's amazing, what the human psyche will do to try to right the messed up circumstances that people can live in. And I've battled my own. I've got anxiety.
I bet.
I've dealt with a lot of anxiety myself. I have little OCD tendencies.
Yeah.
And there are things like that are experienced by people who are in these cults, and they don't understand that one of the reasons they're experiencing it is the cult that they're in. And and it's just very sad, and it hurts so many people. And
it really does.
Yeah, and then it really makes me sick how your brother's suicide was used to cement things, because I know with Jehovah's Witnesses, what they want us, if we're going to leave, they're not going to help us. They want
Yeah.
us to suffer and to have the worst life imaginable so that we can come back. Also, they can say, see, we were
Yep.
right.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
they are willing to do anything to
Yep.
watch you fail. You know, whether that's not teaching you basic life skills as
Oh
you
my
grow
goodness,
up.
yes.
Yes, because, you know, when you leave, you don't know how to just, you know, pay rent or
Well,
get a
yeah.
job or anything.
Well, that's the big thing that I've realized since coming out is how ill-equipped we were.
Yeah.
I mean, because we were taught there was a huge age hierarchy, first of all. So my little brother and I were at the very bottom of the power structure. Um, and so not only with that, so everything we did was dictated to us by others. We were
Mm-hmm.
taught that you can't trust yourself, your heart's evil,
Oh,
your heart
yes.
is wicked. If you trust your own choices, that's wrong. I once bought a pair of pants I really liked, and they were cargo pants, and I remember thinking it was really cute, but I was told that was evil and wrong because they looked too masculine. We were allowed to wear jeans. They just had to be a specific kind.
Okay.
Um, but it was like that kind of thing, like literally every choice was dictated
Yes.
by someone else. So when my younger brother, I love him so much, but when he was kicked out at 17, he had no skills, no way to
Right.
he didn't know how to manage money. He didn't know how to pay bills. He didn't know anything. And so of course he kind of crashed and burned and used some really negative coping skills because he had no idea how to fend for himself
Yeah.
and think for himself.
The only thing we
And
were taught was how to, well, in your case, it may have been to hate others,
yeah,
or in our case, I mean, it was essentially that it was to hate their behavior,
yeah,
and honestly, as much as we were taught, you know, kind of the love the sinner, hate the sin type
yeah,
thing, the honest truth is, we were judging other people very adversely for their conduct,
yeah.
so that we could feel better about ourselves,
That's
and
really what
and
it was.
and
Yeah.
so it was hating on, even if it wasn't true hatred of. And so,
Yes.
you know, we were hating on other people all the time so that we could feel better about ourselves, and that, like, that's all we had. And so
I
then
know.
you leave, and now you need to, what, are you going to rely on these people that you've judged adversely and hated for so long? You know, that's such a mind warp. And
Well, and that was one of the really interesting things coming back into contact with my brother and getting close with him again was hearing how much the cult beliefs impacted him. Like he
yeah.
had to rely on other people, but he would talk about them in a way that was very much from the cult, or he would feel really and obviously I can't speak from his story, but
Right.
that there was just always this the deep ingrained patterns in our brain to distrust everyone except for 14 people really caused us a
Yeah.
lot of problems.
I don't come by trust easy.
Nope. Me either.
Not at all.
I don't know that how you can.
I don't either. Not after something like that. It's
No,
very difficult to do so.
it really
Um,
is.
which then makes it difficult to have, you know, truly great relationships with people, because you have a hard
Yeah.
time letting go.
Yep.
Because we're most of us who leave cults have issues with control and feeling out of control.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is difficult. But yeah, it's just I hate that you know, your brother was used in that way. And I know, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses kind of have like this self-fulfilling prophecy where they'll tell people that, you know, here is what worldly people are on the outside. There are these people that essentially just basically have sex with anything that moves, you
Yeah.
know,
Mhm.
will kill and murder, you know, will murder or steal
Yep.
or do anything for themselves. They're all selfish. And so then people who leave often fulfill that prophecy, you know,
Uh-huh.
that they become that because they think they need to in order to fit in.
Yeah.
And then life turns to garbage, and then they come back to the cult, and then the cult
Yep.
uses them as an
As an
experience of,
example.
yeah, look how bad it is out there. And that's the same thing they did with your brother. And
Yeah.
it's just so horrible that the way you see, even in this small family cult, essentially it's one narcissist teaching other people to be narcissists.
Yeah.
You see how they manipulate everything to make themselves look good.
Yeah.
And it's so petty. And you know, even like your mom, who, um, had so much fear
Yeah.
and was probably, I assume, at the beginning, maybe even a very humble person, because often people with a lot of fear kind of can be at first.
Yeah.
And then once they start internalizing that narcissistic stuff, then it all becomes about defensive and ego, and
Oh, of
that the
course.
humility is gone. And it's just sad to see, good people who are hurt
Yeah.
end up internalizing and becoming so much of what, this narcissist happens to preach. And I imagine that that would have bled through. And so you said you were homeschooled.
Hmm.
um did it bleed through just in your relationship? I assume with each other. I mean, it kind
Oh,
of sounds
yeah.
like you had to tell on each other,
There was a
and
huge tattletale culture.
yeah.
And that caused a lot of issues. We also were never like we were taught that emotions were bad.
Oh
So
yes.
that caused a lot of problems, as you can imagine, especially I am fairly stereotypical of like the creative personality, so I feel things really deeply.
Yeah.
I have a lot of emotions and I was never given the words or the ability to tell them, so they often came out in destructive ways, like you were saying, like with the control thing with the
Sure.
eating disorder, with self-harm, with other maladaptive um, behaviors that were just used as coping skills.
Yeah, I think that
Um,
that whole teaching about the heart being treacherous and who can know it, and not
yeah,
not trusting your own heart, I think that is just the well, maybe it's not the most, but it has to be at least one of the most insidious and harmful things that is taught by a lot of these religions and cults. You know,
I honestly think it's the most crippling, and it's the
yeah,
one that is the best for them,
yeah,
for the cult leaders, because it gives you a population of people who can't trust themselves
yeah.
and who can't make their own decisions and who are terrified of any internal feelings or beliefs or anything they might have, because the heart is wicked and will lead you astray. And after I came out, that was one of the most difficult things I had to face into. I could face into a lot of the other things, like, okay, I really hurt a lot of people. So I reached out and I apologized, and I was able to face into that before I was able to realize that, like, oh, I can trust myself.
Oh yeah.
That has, I'm still not there. And I think it will take a while, because when
Sure.
you teach someone from the smallest of age that they're they're prone to wickedness and they're evil at their core,
Hmm.
and everything their heart says, like, for example, I really loved rock climbing and I got really into it, and this was as an adult in the cult, and I was told, like, I was told that I was only doing it because I was prideful and that I was wrong, and I like got reamed out for something that I loved as a human.
Yeah.
Like, as a human, I found it really, really satisfying. It's like a puzzle you have to solve with your body. Like, rock climbing's wonderful. But because of this idea that we can't trust ourselves and things that we like probably aren't right, like, that got taken away from me. And that's just one example of many of the way that not being able to listen to your own wishes and wants was really used against us. And similarly, I imagine the concept of death to self, of this idea that, like, yourself is bad and so you need to give it up,
Hmm.
was used, especially in the context of like disagreements or anything. Like, the idea was that you needed to let go of anything you wanted so that the other person could get what they wanted. Um,
Oh yes.
and so that was a really
Yeah.
problematic idea, especially when used by the cult leader, because he could get us to do whatever he
Right.
wanted. He got my mom to take a second mortgage out on our house to support him because he never worked,
Of
through this
course not.
idea.
Right.
And he, just that concept was constantly being told, especially if we had any doubts or any concerns. It's like, die to yourself, die to yourself. um they used to say you should be lower than the dog dish, um like,
Wow.
on the floor. Yeah, that was like a phrase that we used for how we should think of ourselves, is that, like, even more humble than a dog dish. And I think that um that again was a problematic idea, because then if you have any pride in yourself, like, oh, I painted a cool painting, or wow, that business I started really worked, or anything like that, that was, you were being prideful, you were being evil. I once, as a 13-year-old, learned to bake pie, and I was really proud of myself for it because I taught myself. And I got called out by the most gentle, quiet person in the whole cult, the one who like never yelled at people. But she wrote all these Bible verses down and told me I was being evil and that pride goes before a fall, all because I was proud of the fact that I could bake peach pie basically blindfolded.
Wow.
And so
And you see that it's not even like, it's not really even pride. It's just joy.
yeah, that's the thing looking back, and my husband's
Yeah.
really helped me see this. He's like, you were just being you. Like
Yeah.
you so much of the characteristics of me as a young person
Yeah.
were called too much and too loud and evil and bad, when it was really just I was a very exuberant, very happy, very full of life, precocious little person. I mean, I was reading, I was painting, I was like doing all these things. And whenever I expressed any like happiness in it, or like, look what I can do, like any little kid, that got really beat out of me.
Yeah,
And
because if you have joy, you don't need them. They
yeah,
need you
yeah.
miserable so that you have to look to them.
Well, and I remember almost to the day, like when I looked around me and saw that my three older sisters and my mom were just always panicked and always anxious and
Yeah.
always like worrying. And I realized that that was my problem. It wasn't anything else. It was that I wasn't being scared enough. So my anxiety really came out really strong. I mean, I remember being anxious as a kid, but once I realized that it was an essential way to survive, it became like the main thing I leaned on. Because if I'm anxious and I'm feeling guilty and I'm feeling scared, then I can't be going to hell because I'm aware that I'm sinning. And so this idea that like you have to just feel this huge weight of guilt and sadness all the time is really insidious and problematic,
Yeah.
because then anytime I felt happy or comfortable, I got terrified because of, oh no, I forgot I'm probably sinning. Because of this idea that we could sin at any time, and we had this really weird definition of sin. Sin was supposed to be like conscious moral rebellion against God, as opposed to like sinning in thought, word, and deed, like the evil Calvinists, like we would say. But the problem with that was so up to interpretation. So
Right.
the cult leader, I once got yelled at because I was helping my aunt fix a faucet, and she wanted me to stop, and I'm like, there's water spraying all over the kitchen, I'm going to keep going on this. And I got called out as being evil and bossy and bad because I didn't immediately listen to her. And
Okay.
so yeah, and so I wasn't consciously doing anything evil, I didn't know,
Right.
but because they had higher authority, they could tell me that I was. And so that was just another level of like anxiety and insecurity that we lived under, because you could be told at any moment that you did something evil. Um,
Wow.
Another good example of this was when I was like 13. There were primarily women in the cult, like I
Yeah,
had
that's
said
I was
earlier.
going I wanted to ask you about that because
Yeah.
that stood out to me and is usually a recipe for abuse.
Oh, it was very much so. All the men in my family got excommunicated by um like my brother was 17, my older brother was in his 20s, and my dad. So they were all excommunicated. Um and then the only men in the cult were the cult leader's brother, obviously the cult leader himself, the cult leader's son, who as a human is a very like he's wonderful. He's one of my favorite people, but he's very passive and he's not gonna kick up a fuss.
Hmm.
Unlike my brothers who both kicked up fusses. Um, and then the only other one was a young man who joined from the outside world, um, who did so because he had a really difficult growing up. And he also was someone who was really drawn to this like prophet living against the world with this belief that only a few people know. Like it was a very attractive hero narrative for him.
Oh,
So
sure.
so those were the only men in the group. Later there was another, my stepfather joined, similar, very soft spoken, very quiet. He and then my sister's now ex-husband joined knowing it was a cult, actually. And he joined because he was so in love with my sister and wanted to save her, and that didn't end up happening. But it was really interesting that the only people who really lasted who were male were people who were either related to the cult leader or were very quiet, easily led, type type B personalities.
And am I correct in assuming that the males that were there, even the passive ones, were higher in the authority structure than any women? Or
Actually, no, that was one of the really
really?
weird things. So
That's
there's a lot
unique.
of things about our cult that are pretty obvious and normal, but then there were some really weird things. And this is one of them. My oldest sister was second highest in the cult. Well, third before my aunt died, but she really was incredibly passionate and really bought into everything. I mean, the cult closed down around her when she was about 13, which is at a kind of a perfect age for hero worship and like really wanting to become a certain way. And so she actually took over the cult, although she can't admit it. So, but she took over the cult after the cult leader left.
Hmm.
But it was really interesting looking at like the structure and how things were set up. There wasn't another man that was as high up as the cult leader. I think his brother was probably like fourth, but the cult leader was constantly shaming and like deriding the other adults in the group to bring them down and like have people have less respect for them.
Sure.
And whereas he would raise the younger people, and I think that was because they were easier to manipulate.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like my sister especially was really easy to manipulate. And she really had a rough go of it because of that system. But yeah, no, it was very untraditional in some other ways too. Like
Hmm.
if you think of cults, lots of people think like long jean skirts and no makeup and like all these things. And the best way to understand it is that all of my uncle's personal opinions became our laws. And so he believed that women are supposed to look a certain way so that they glorify God. So we were supposed to always wear makeup, and even if we wore jeans, they had to be a certain kind and we had to look a certain way, but it wasn't your typical alt-right conservative look.
So what was he getting out of it? Because was it just power for him, or I mean, because I mean, let's face it, a lot of people who do this for money, for sex, for power. You know, like what was it for him in particular?
I think it's a number of things. First off, he had this idea of himself as like a tortured prophet who had these ideas. And he, during this whole time, was producing movies, writing numerous articles a week that were getting published. He was going on radio programs.
Hmm.
So he had an amount of influence that was really spoke to him as like a power hungry person.
Sure.
He also had a lot of
That's why I
power
do
over.
this podcast.
I'm not going to be concerned until you start doing it with David Duke, okay? But so there was that power. He also was able to really dictate other people's lives, which I think was important. He got a lot of money out of it. And he was able to have us do what he wanted. There wasn't sexual abuse, thankfully. I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, very fortunate there.
Yeah, because that often goes hand in hand. It was primarily a pretty intense spiritual and emotional abuse.
Yeah.
But fortunately, that did not factor into it. I think he just got the narrative that he wanted himself to be of this like fighting prophet. That's what he really got out of it.
Yeah, he just kind of had like an internal life that he created externally. You know, whatever
that's something
was in his head, he kind of made it happen.
He could make it happen. Yeah, and in so many ways. I mean, we grew up cleaning his house for him, and I gave him a lot of my money. And I would buy him art supplies, and I would model for him, and all these different things. He was just very much treated as like the center of our universe. And we were talking about it later after the cult ended and things. And one of the things that he really used was this whole hero narrative, this idea that it was us against the world,
Hmm.
that he was this persecuted person who got the truth and then shared it with us, and the world just wasn't ready for him. And it's a very attractive idea.
Hmm.
Um, because it gives your life purpose. If
Yeah.
you think that you are part of this group where you are supporting a prophet and you are helping truth happen and maybe you're saving lives, like it's really attractive. And
Absolutely.
that made that, of course, so he got a huge ego boost out of it. And like in addition to power, he had all these people following that narrative, like just basically worshiping him in a lot of ways. And that's a pretty attractive thing for a narcissist, I'd
Oh
say.
yeah, he became God. I mean,
He was.
everybody was at his whim and his dictate, and
Well, yeah, and we thought of him as being like God's mouthpiece, basically. And we,
yeah.
his brother would end almost all cult meetings talking about how we were nourished by the meat of this meeting today, and aren't we so glad we're not normal Christians who only get milk and all
Oh,
this
I
stuff.
love it. It's so like it's just
Yep,
amazing how these similarities run
I
through these
know, I
cults.
know.
I mean, it's just I think that Charles Taze Russell, who started Jehovah's Witnesses in the 1800s, he said that he was God's mouthpiece. I
Yep,
think he self-declared that, and you just see these people. They are getting something out of it, even if it isn't
yeah,
always as nefarious as some sort of horrific sexual abuse or whatever.
yeah.
It can be as simple as power, as being able to.
And an ego boost.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. So
Well,
then,
and
go ahead.
go ahead.
No,
I
you
was
go.
just going to say people who I've talked to since coming out who knew him in the past, like
Right.
my uncle who was excommunicated, my mom's brother. It's really interesting to hear them describe him because he was the kind of person that's just incredibly caustic and self-absorbed,
Right.
and like so many people just hate him as a human. But the people who were fragile or had trauma in their past or needed like a cause in their life,
Yeah.
those are the ones that got entrapped by him. That's why my aunt married him. I mean, he was this handsome, well-spoken, very confident man who was like, who was like this prophet and this
Sure.
hero. And there was this mystical aura about him that a lot of people who were more sensible were like, what the actual bleep, like
Right.
this is
Right.
not normal. But those of us who were either grown up in it, so we didn't know anything else, or came to it out of a place of trauma, um, he was so elevated. And it makes perfect sense to me why he would want that, is because he got to fulfill the idea of himself he had in his head, which is something
Sure.
we rarely get as humans, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, because we do have to live among the collective, among the community.
Yep.
It's not all about us.
Well, and it's interesting because he seemed to have this idea of himself from very young. And so I like to think about like, well, when I was young, I wanted to be a mother of 100, an artist, a veterinarian, like all these things. Like,
Right.
but I obviously that's not a possibility
Right.
or a life I would want now. But he seemed to never be able to let go of himself as this ideal human. And honestly, his childhood was also full of a lot of trauma. His
Of course it
parents
was.
were extremely active politically. They would march against the gay movement. There was a lot of really like anti-communist, like some stuff that was sure, okay, whatever, that's your beliefs, that's fine. But he really took on this idea that he was this lone hero, and it caused an incredible amount of problems for an incredible amount of people,
And
unfortunately.
it's amazing because you see this stuff, and it's just amazing how one person can take on something like that,
Yeah,
and like you said, hurt so many people, and it's very sad. I mean, even you can still have some measure of compassion for the person, for just to realize that, like,
yeah.
they were set on a path, but for some reason that person bought into that path and didn't wake up.
Well, and
And
I think that's something really important to realize is
yeah,
that we as humans are fallible and we
absolutely.
are very, very flawed.
Hmm.
And so often there are things in our past that push us on a path we may not have been on otherwise.
Hmm.
And while I have there's a lot of hurt in that area, and I don't I mean, it's not that I'm still, like, I haven't forgiven him or whatever. Like, I have, but at the same time, there's so much hurt in that relationship.
Yes.
And I don't think it will ever be resolved, but I still can look at it kind of objectively and think,
Yes.
like, this happened. You have stuff in your past I don't know about, and that's what you did. And for example, his brother has been the most difficult because my sister married the cult leader's brother's son.
Okay.
Um, so two women from two different generations married into this other family from two different generations. We're not related, but we're so my since my sister married his son, though, the cult leader still lives in her basement. They live on the same property as her in-laws, and the cult leader's brother is still convinced that everything his brother taught was right. And that's largely due to the fact, in my opinion, that he based his whole life around supporting his brother and doing everything his brother wanted. And if he believed now at the age of 70 plus that his brother was wrong, his whole life comes down.
Yep.
Like, there's everything that he worked for and fought for and did only exists within this framework of this idea that his brother is a prophet and unique and saving the world. And so I say that to say that, like, I feel very lucky that I was as young as I was when I came out, because I was able to rebuild my life in a lot of ways, and
So let's
I'm
let's
still
talk
am.
let's talk about how you got to that point. So you had mentioned that you had this kind of like these two eras of your life. There was before
Yes.
your brother left, and then your older brother, and then after he left.
Yes.
So then, as you were a teenager or whatever, how did you progress to this point where you did eventually leave?
So I had a lot of doubts, even though I gave up most of them, but I still, it was difficult. I graduated high school when I was 15.
Wow.
Yeah, well, it
Accelerated
wasn't a very,
homeschooling.
it was a um snail mail college
Right.
or high school.
Right.
I got a diploma. I really wish I could had gone to regular high school because I could have done like advanced placement things. But anyway, so when I was 16, I started going to college, and that sort of helped me start getting out there. But at the same time, a lot of my friends were what I thought were fellow Christians, but they were people I couldn't trust, and I couldn't, like, I wanted to go to church with them, but I couldn't. It was very complicated. I made some deep friendships that I had to excommunicate people from. So my teenage years were pretty fraught as far as I would find people that I loved and wanted to be with, and then they'd leave because of the cult. Um, and that was really difficult because,
So you
like,
had to
my whole,
shun them.
yes. So that would be really painful because people would either leave and kind of like never talk to me again because they're like, whoa, this girl's crazy. Or they would love, like, I would, like, my best friend of years, I ended up having to shun her based on she was pro-Israel and we were anti-Semitic. And that was really painful. And that was one of the decisions, along with, in the same time period, having to shun my younger brother, who'd been my best friend and my closest person the whole time, were the things that really started kind of pulling off the boards on the windows of my life in a way, like, started really letting light get in and let me, like, really
Yeah.
start doubting this idea. It was those really painful moments that helped me understand. And right around this time, my brother commits suicide. And then a couple years later, my grandmother, who was a really important part of the cult and part of my life, she died at the age of 94, which much less sad than my brother, but still, like, it was a big
Sure.
change.
Yeah.
And then my aunt, the cult leader's wife, committed suicide shortly thereafter.
Oh no, really?
Yeah. And that was an incredibly painful thing. She'd been sick for a really long time. She had a brain tumor when I was 14, which just exacerbated all of her mental issues. She devolved from this meticulous how housekeeper that just, her whole home was beautiful. She dressed impeccably. She was going to be a concert pianist, and really descended into madness. And by the end, she was keeping bits of candy wrappers because of the color. She was writing nonsense on her walls. She really descended into an intense madness that the cult leader blamed on the demons, because the work he was doing on the internet was so important that
Satan had to personally attack them, and there's no way it's just normal mental illness. No, it has to be the demons. And so when she committed suicide, he called her a martyr. He said that Satan himself threw her off the bridge, and it was treated just completely differently than my brother's suicide, of course.
Oh, of course. Wow.
And my aunt committed suicide because she wrote this really long letter because she said that she was too evil to still be on this earth, and her presence was causing God pain, and she had to die in order to glorify him. And that was really difficult. It was difficult in a lot of ways. In some ways, it was like she had suffered so much throughout her life. She was one of the most tortured humans I've ever met. She married my uncle after having an intense depressive episode where she attempted to commit suicide and had all these other issues. And I found out later, especially, he was incredibly abusive to her in all ways that a husband can be, and really oppressed her. She was anorexic, and he encouraged that. He told her that when she gained any weight, she was ugly and she needed to lose more weight. And it was just an incredibly toxic, awful relationship. And it was the one that I idolized growing up, thinking that's what an ideal marriage is.
Sure, right.
That was really painful too. But it was after that my uncle descended deeper into his really intense beliefs, because my aunt, as sick as she was it's hard because she was also a fanatic. I mean, she was his original fanatic in a lot of ways.
Right.
But she had just a touch more compassion and kindness, and she was a zealot, but more so for like the biblical Jesus in some ways. And so she kind of helped him from going off the rails. I mean, he was off the rails, but she helped him from going like
she
way
balanced him
up
out a little bit. Yeah,
just a little bit.
Yeah. It's hard to stop
much.
a runaway train, but
and we didn't know how much until she was gone. And that's when he really went off the rails and became more and more racist and more anti-Semitic. Around this time period, I went on a couple mission trips with my best friend who joined the cult as a grown-up. Because of it, she was in an abusive family situation. That's how it always goes.
Of course.
But we went on a couple mission trips to Haiti.
How old were you then?
First time I think I was 21, and then I was 23. So I was a young adult, but around this time was when my uncle got more and more racist. And so while we were okay to go to Haiti, there was a lot of talk about how it's, the Haitians people's fault because they believe in voodoo, and that's why all these bad things have happened. And like, there was a lot of racist belief that went unchecked.
Well,
and the thing
aren't the Haitian people largely black?
Yeah,
And I mean, somebody had to fund this. Was the mission trip through your cult, or was it through something else?
It was through a different mission.
Oh,
no one It was outside of it. We did separate fundraising. It was my sister, my best friend, is a nurse, and it was a nursing thing. And so she went by herself, and that was okay. But it was definitely not through.
Okay, yeah, I was trying to figure out how this racist was sending you to Haiti.
No, we had permission to go, which is still one of the most surprising things.
Yeah, that is very surprising.
But I think one of the reasons was that there was this like double thought of like, Black people are evil, but we should help them.
Right.
And so
they need us.
Yeah, they need us. And
the white knight to come in and save them.
Which is crazy because when I went there, I mean, I learned a lot more from them than they learned from me.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Of course I did. And it's still one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. And I think it did help me in coming out and just realizing how big the world is and how much people can suffer, and yet they can still be wonderful, amazing, kind people. The people I met in Haiti were, it's just hard to explain how amazing and loving and opening they were, even like across the language barrier.
Sure,
and I really credit that with helping me kind of find a way out. But it was around this time that my uncle was writing a lot more. He was on a lot of political or wasn't podcast yet. It was radio stations. I should mention, we were taught from a young age that politics was like really important. And so I think my first memory of picketing is when I was like 3. And we did pro-life picketing, but we also did free speech and stuff against Israel. And I mean, I grew up, I have distinct memories. We would call the senators and vote against bills, what we were told to do. And I have distinct memories of like sitting, doing my chores in the kitchen while being on the phone and like, my name is thus and so. We'd make up names a lot of the time, so we could call more and be like, I'm from thus and so, and I vote against this bill. And so my uncle, who'd always been very like, politics are like, we have to change politics, he got more and more intense, and he was talking with more alt-right people. And then he decided that he had solved the age-old question of free will. And he came up with the idea that Jesus sinned by letting free will into the world. That's why he had to die. Jesus
What?
was, yeah, I know. So fortunately, all of us who still believed we were Christians and were biblical Christians, this did not work for us. It was the one idea that he came up with that was too far. And it sparked a 6-week battle in the cult, where my mother and my sister, who edited all of his articles and typed everything up for him, were like, you cannot publish this. This is not right. And we all fought against him. Well, especially my family. The other family was quieter. But he just kept saying, no, this is right. I'm right. And finally, at the end of the 6 weeks, he goes, well, I have an announcement that after much thought, the Holy Spirit has told me that this is not a biblical idea. And he basically like agreed with all the points we'd made, but claimed that the Holy Spirit told him instead of the 6 weeks of us.
Yeah.
Yes. And then quite out of the blue, just a week later, he sent an email to everyone saying he could no longer be leader of this congregation, that we were too unruly and evil, and he was quitting.
Oh, I have to stop on that for a minute. I love that. I love these people. These cult leaders they're so fragile.
I know.
At the same time that they're so narcissistic, and I mean, they're just bullies is all they are.
Yeah.
And they get punched in the nose one time, and they whine and take their ball and go home.
Well, the best part about this is that he had told us our whole lives, because we did reproofs. He said, if I ever do anything wrong, I just want you to tell me. Like our whole lives, like every month at least, we hear this, right? And then we finally have an issue that's worth going to the mat on, and that we need to call him out on, and he acts like the biggest baby in the world.
Gosh.
And he loses it, and he's just like, he up and quits.
Well, I mean, let's face it. Look, and I'm not trying to make this political. I am not a person, to be quite honest, I'm not a Democrat nor a Republican. I'm just me. I'm just me, and I have my own ideas, and I don't need to pick a side because they're so polarized and everything. But, we have in office right now a man who exhibits those qualities. The second that you say anything about him, you punch him in the nose a little bit, he goes off and whines like a baby.
Yes.
And it's amazing, when you see someone who is a narcissist and has that big of an ego, they cannot take any criticism
at all.
No, not at all. And it's honestly, it's sad on a level.
Oh, it is.
Because what you see almost is a small child that has never fully grown up and matured.
Yeah.
And my dad was that way somewhat. He was the type who, I mean, as soon as you questioned him on anything, everybody's persecuting him and everybody's ganging up on him and wah, wah, wah. The things that he would literally do to us all the time.
Oh, of course.
And it's amazing to see how fragile these cults are. And it just makes you wonder, yours was a small family cult, and so
Yeah.
the numbers were different. But I've always wondered, if enough people were to stand up against a larger cult, let's take Jehovah's Witnesses for example.
Yeah.
If enough people, because I know there are a lot of people who are who are physically in, but mentally they're out.
Yeah.
They have to physically be in because they know that if they left, they would lose their family and stuff.
Yep.
But you just have to wonder if there were ever enough people that could get together at the same time and just say, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not playing this game. And if all those people who had doubts, and if all those people who knew for sure that it was wrong would just at one time stand up and voice themselves in a very public way, what would happen? Would the leaders at the top who are just bullies, would they crumble? Would they cave? We've seen even in Jehovah's Witnesses in the organization, there have been policy changes at times. It's usually because of outside governmental pressures.
Yeah.
But they do have the ability to make changes. And I just wonder, at what point would it all come crumbling down, or at what point would they at least have to make changes, even if they said that the Holy Spirit revealed it to them, to save face on some level so that they could keep their power. You just have to wonder what would happen. And it's just it's so petty and silly to watch, somebody like your uncle just tap out because one time you all stood up.
Yep. Well, honestly, I think that's why I've been so drawn to dystopian literature throughout my teenage years, is because
that.
You see that happen in those books often. The best of them are the minority makes it a majority and finally stands up to this tiny amount of people that are hurting everyone.
Right.
That's basically the plot of Divergent, of that series, is the idea that people finally realize that what they're living in is wrong. And I think that we do have an immense amount of power. But as a culture, it's really hard to stand up and to all come together and unite against them. But because we are such a small cult, we were able to do that in a way that I don't think is possible when you have 10 times the numbers that we did. I mean, we were so small that one voice was enough. And it's interesting looking back too, my oldest sister, who was higher up in the cult, was the most impacted, I think, by the cult leader. Whereas I, who was way, way down, at the bottom, I was more impacted by her and by my mother, because the cult leader, some of the doubts that I had were when he would get all butthurt over nothing. He would spend hours yelling at my mother, who to me was just the most amazing woman, because that's all I knew then.
Right.
Or my sister, these people who I thought were holy and wonderful and good, he's telling them they're going to hell, or that he's comparing them to Miriam in the Bible, who gets leprosy for standing up to Moses, all these things. And so for me, seeing that really caused me to doubt him as a person, in a way that I don't think would have happened if he hadn't been so petty.
Yes. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It is funny or sad how, it ends up, one of the things I've talked about with my wife, and I think I may have mentioned on a podcast before, is just that you have the greater cult.
Yeah.
And then you often have cults within the cult, and often they are family systems.
Yeah.
My dad was very authoritarian. My wife's dad was very authoritarian.
Yeah.
And you see the cult within the cult, and it's just this family. And so just like you, the way you looked up to your mom and your sister, we looked up to our parents, whether it was my dad or my mom, depending on the situation, or same with my wife. And it's just interesting how those power structures are then, made into these tiny power structures within the cult.
It really is interesting.
It is.
And that's something that we noticed more once we came out, is how much our family structure, the unit with my mom and us 4 girls and my little brother, really got so, I mean, I think a lot of issues that would have just come from being a family and having lots of women got just magnified and twisted because of the belief system, and because my sister suddenly like took kind of the like cult leader role in our family, and she would individually like tell us what we could and couldn't do, and she would give us reproof from her place, that like it was like a secondary cult
Yeah.
in my family, in a way that it wasn't quite the same for the other family. Partly I think because the cult leader's brother was his older brother, and while he idealized everything his brother did, he still, there were some aspects where he was able to be like, oh, that's just my brother, he's being a little absurd, in a way that we who believed him absolutely just couldn't do.
Right. He had that
A tiny bit more
familial.
perspective.
Yeah, he had perspective. He grew up with him, so
Yes.
he's seen his brother, you know, act out in different ways.
Yes.
And
Whereas
there's
for
a
us,
different
he
power
was,
dynamic.
yeah, whereas for us, he was God in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So
So then you go on this trip, this mission trip, you come back, and then this issue comes up within the cult, and your uncle takes it very badly and basically says, "I'm out." Was that it? Was that the end of the cult, or how did things go after that?
no, it was a very long process. The cult leader left, and it was really shocking. He left by email. He didn't even like come and tell us. He just sent a mass email, and it caused a lot of issues in my family, because my mom and my sister were so vocal and were such a key part in them. In him quitting, there was a lot of like pain there, and sadness, and like hurt. But we didn't know we were in a cult, especially
Sure.
me.
Right.
We thought we were Christians. We thought that what we did was unusual, but it wasn't problematic. Um, I have recently found a letter that my sister wrote me when I was 14, my oldest sister. And it starts out with, "I'm sorry I wasn't kinder to you about your fears that we were in a cult.
Hmm.
And I didn't take you seriously." And then it goes on to say, well, technically, according to Webster's dictionary, we are in a cult, but that doesn't matter because we have the right set of beliefs. And so we'd come up against this over and over. I mean, people would hear you're in a small home church and be like, oh, it's a cult. And so when he left, it wasn't like we were like, oh, we're waking up. We were still so indoctrinated with this idea
Yeah, the
that we
beliefs were
had the
still there.
truth.
Yeah,
The beliefs were so solid. And my sister, although I'm pretty sure she doesn't understand how this happened, and she really took over, and she led what happened next. She would dictate how the meetings went. For a while there, we were like each given a week of the year to do a presentation, and she would be really harsh and critical. For example, at 24, 23, I gave my little speech for the cult meeting, and it wasn't good enough, so I had to do it again, and like re-research. And so it was a very weird, nebulous time period where we were starting to like come into our own, but we were still very crippled by this idea that we were perfect, and we had this idea. I mean, because we grew up being one way in the cult, and then having to present this united, perfect family front to the world, it was really complicated.
Yeah, you can take the person out of the cult, but you can't take the cult out of the person.
No, well, hopefully
that's
eventually.
Up to them. Right. But I just mean, not instantly anyway. Just because you leave doesn't mean that it's over.
Absolutely
or
not.
Just because he left. Yeah.
Since we felt that what we were doing was still valuable.
Right. Obviously.
And, so it was about 2 years of that. And in the middle of those 2 years, my sister decided to suspend because we weren't allowed to date. I was 23, and we were never supposed to date or anything. It was all this controlled. The cult leader literally picked husbands for people.
Oh.
It was almost an arranged marriage sort of thing, especially for one sister. she did have an arranged marriage, basically.
Well, and that'd be very difficult in such an insular cult because there aren't many
No, there wasn't
people.
anyone. And there was this idea that God would just bring your person, which just doesn't happen,
Right.
especially if you're crazy. And because we, a lot of us worked at the same place because what we did for a living was dictated. Like I went to college, but I was encouraged to not go to college for anything that I couldn't do at home with children. So things that I wanted to do, like nursing, I'm a bit of a geology buff and I really wanted to do that, but you can't do that and have kids. And like all these things were still really like dictated. But for me, what changed is when my sister decided that a single girl should be allowed to date, which was very exciting because there were a lot of us. There was my one sister married the only guy in the cult that was available. And then my other sister married a guy that she'd known that found the cult leader's book independently, and like that meant he loved her husband, and he picked that person for her. But the rest of us had no opportunity. I mean,
yeah.
There just wasn't a chance. And we would occasionally meet people in the outside world, bring them back. I had one that lasted as long as a year and a half, but he eventually left after realizing we were a cult. He was brave enough as a young person to give a list. He wrote down a long letter about his issues with the cult. And it's something that I didn't know till later. And I'm still impressed with him about that. But when my sister decided we could start dating, that was really when my world started opening up. I got on eHarmony and within 3 days met my husband.
Wow.
Which was very problematic for my family because they thought we were just going to start dating around, and I found someone I could be serious with almost immediately. And for me, talking to him, he was a pastor's kid, he's from the Midwest, he's very grounded and logical, and trying to explain my quote unquote Christian beliefs to him helped me kind of see the chasm there and that we were so different, especially when I started talking about excommunication. I think that was the biggest thing, that he was just like, you did what? Especially around my little brother and my best friend, and realizing that those weren't things I could stand behind. And maybe I didn't have to. And it was that idea that really helped me start recognizing how problematic our belief systems had been, and that maybe we weren't what we thought we were.
Right.
And so it was that discussion, like, because he was I don't know why he stuck around. My family was really awful to him. Even though I was an adult, they put intense rules on us. Like we could only talk 2 hours at a time, twice a week, maybe. We weren't supposed to text each other or email each other. And we were in 2 different cities, 200 miles apart. And so it's not like we could just hang out all the time either. And it was through that period and seeing my mom especially really go crazy, because before the cult leader had been kind of above her, and so she couldn't go as nuts as she went with us. And she just kind of, she treated me like I was 15 and dating an evil person, and it was just a really awful situation. But it was through that I was able to see that, oh, my family's not infallible, and our belief systems are whack. So for me, that's what really helped. My oldest sister around the same time started talking more seriously with her ex-husband. That they were married at the point. They're divorced now, but he was the one who joined the cult knowing that it was a cult.
Oh, yes.
He joined to help get her out. But it was, from her perspective, an arranged marriage because she didn't have the same feelings, and the cult leader kind of made it happen.
Right.
But he really helped her and me, because I was pretty close with him, still am, helped like started slowly pointing out things that the cult leader did that were really wrong and really unbiblical. And so it was like a slow progression for my family to kind of all like realize that what we believed wasn't correct. And my family, I think, was a little more ready to believe that because my sister was so intense in that belief. And she'd always been the leader for our family since my dad left. And so we were able to follow her. Whereas the other family in the cult, which was the cult leader's brother's family, much, much slower to follow because, of course, he still believed that what his brother did was right. And he actually excommunicated all of us for a while, specifically my older sister, but kind of cut us all off for a couple months and then realized that that wouldn't really work since his son married one of us. And so if he cut us off, he'd lose like everything. So,
So how was the shunning then? You said, I think earlier, it sounds like the fact that you shunned, that you excommunicated, I think was the term that you used. Your brother, your best friend, like that was kind of a pivotal moment when you were talking with your now husband.
Yes.
About that. It's kind of one of the things that I guess opened your eyes to the fact that this wasn't a good way to be.
It really did. I had always struggled with that. I remember like a lot of my doubts after my brother left were like, why do we have to live this way? Other people don't lose people from their lives. Other people don't. I mean, I have a lot of extended family that we were completely cut off from. And we had to shun, and I thought, okay, well, this is what we have to do. But it never sat well with me. So when my husband basically sat there on Skype, kind of like we are now, and told me, like, I don't understand why you did that, I was able to start thinking about it and start realizing that maybe I didn't have to do it that way. And I was the first among my family to really shun the idea of shunning.
I like that.
And I reached out to so many people that I had shunned or had gotten shunned by the church that I was in, the cult. For example, I reached out to my little brother first and got him back in the family. I reached out to my best friend who she became a missionary and was out of the country, but we were still able to like resolve. I have still, like within the last couple of weeks, remembered someone that I may have really hurt and I reached out to them. So that's been a big part of my coming out of the cult, is awesome. Reaching out to those people that I shut out of my life, trying to explain kind of where I was coming from, but also own the fact that I did that. Because I think one of the biggest parts of this, and one of the things that really separate a lot of us in this situation, are being able to own what you did versus just saying it all happened to you. And that's been a lot of problems in my personal family, my with my sisters, is some of them can still have a hard time owning the fact that they made choices in the cult, because we were so young and we were doing our best. I recognize that. But for me, it's been really important to me to own what happened and to say I'm still like, I had quite a few friends that I got into the cult, who left or who got excommunicated, and reaching out to those people and saying, I had no idea. I'm really sorry. Whatever I did that hurt you, I apologize, has been really important for me as a human, and also to feel like I have some level of control. And almost everyone, I think there's only been one or two, but almost everyone has responded with intense kindness and grace and love. And especially my best friend, who I unfortunately excommunicated her right before her mother died of brain cancer. And she was my first long distance friend, only like an hour away, but I lost that entire community because I got pretty close with them. But she, who I think had more reason to be angry than most, was just so gracious and so kind and so loving about it. And I have another friend who she actually told me, she's like, I knew you guys were in a cult, and I knew that my only hope of helping you, because I knew you had a good heart, was to not get excommunicated. So she did everything she could. She stopped coming to the cult meetings because she knew there were cult meetings, but she did everything she could to stay in my life and be there for me. And she's been one of the most helpful people coming out of it. And it's been amazing coming out and realizing that these people that we were taught were evil and bad and all these things are so much more kind and loving and gracious than we, who thought we were the cream of the crop, ever were. And it's really helped me especially to realize that grace comes in many forms, and that grace and love, that's the thing I can really believe in, is giving grace to others and giving love to them. And I don't, obviously religion is still really painful and fraught for me, but that idea that like you can forgive and you can give grace and you can give love was so foreign, because we were taught that you couldn't do that unless you agreed 100% with the other person's attitude and lifestyle, and recognizing that I can, give unconditional love has just been the most amazing experience of my life.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's beautiful. It reminds me of, and I hope I don't get this wrong. I've never been in a 12-step program, but I know that one of the steps is to make amends.
Yes.
And you have to think about it. That person who's making amends, many times they're making amends for things that they did while they were drunk or high or in their disease, as they say. And, while those things contributed to it, they don't excuse all of it,
Yes.
And so there has to be some understanding for it, which, you're experiencing through making your own amends. There's some understanding on these other people's parts, but it helps to see that the person is taking their own accountability and responsibility for what they did. And you're doing that, by apologizing.
Well, and I think that that's been one of the biggest things for me that has helped me, is just being really transparent about, I'm just doing my best. And I know that I effed up. I don't know if I can say that real word, but a lot.
That's fine. Yeah.
My therapist said I should start swearing because we weren't allowed to. So it's.
So there you go. It was fucked up. You can say it.
It was fucked up. It was a really fucked up situation.
Yep.
Really, really shitty. And being able to like own that and move forward, I think has been the most important part of my recovery, and being able to say, like, I still don't know. There was a moment I was in residential treatment for an eating disorder a few months ago, still working on that. But in residential, it was really interesting because we shared so much about our stories, and everyone had so much trauma and sadness. But they were all so gracious to me, particularly around, since I was raised to be so homophobic, I'm learning how to interact with people of that. I don't even know how to, like, gay people, I guess, and how to, like, what I should say and what I shouldn't say. And I made a few mistakes, but everyone was just so kind and like, we know your heart's in the right place. We know that you're trying. And
that's how it should be.
It's just so wonderful to experience this grace and this love from people I was taught, A, weren't capable of it, B, weren't worth it. And, get to see this from people that I was never allowed to be friends with. And it's been really a wonderful blessing to, I don't know, to own what happened.
Yeah.
And own the mistakes I made, and just receive love.
Well, and you're, you have to think about it. You're kind of doing right now, like, the opposite of shunning. You're going back, even among people. I don't know if you would you have, in the family cult, would you have said that you shunned gays or black people? Or
yes.
Okay, so you called it shunning then. Okay.
Well, we called it excommunication.
Okay.
But it's the same idea as shunning.
Okay.
Exactly the same.
So you're learning how to now accept those people.
Yes.
And may I ask, is it still hard though?
The guilt is the difficult thing.
Difficult thing.
That's the thing. It's not.
It sounds like you didn't buy in 100% anyway.
I didn't.
So that probably helps.
But the problem was that we were taught that if someone, especially if they claim to be a Christian and were gay or were living with their partner, or were, for example, like an interracial couple, that was viewed as really wrong, that we couldn't be friends with them. There's a passage somewhere in the New Testament that talks about you shouldn't even eat with a sinner. Yes. Constantly. And that was the most difficult thing. Was I was really excited to be able to have friends of different persuasions and be able to just give love to them, and I still do that, but the guilt is still there. There's still so much like, you haven't reproved them, you haven't told them it's bad that they're sleeping with their boyfriend, therefore you're evil and you're going to hell. It's
Right.
like that narrative is still very strong in my head. However, the more that I act against it and the more that I, make rational choices to have gay friends and have friends of different beliefs and all of this, the better it is. And the volume is just really slowly turning down on the cult. It's on the guilt. It's very
Yes.
slow, but
Yeah.
it is going away.
Well, I know, yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses, while they were always super, there's one thing I've got to give Jehovah's Witnesses is they were always very accepting of all people as far as race or ethnicity goes.
Yeah.
They were very progressive in that way, though. Honestly, I have to wonder whether or not some of that at the beginning wasn't just an easy way to get members.
Yeah.
Because in other religions that wouldn't have been allowed, but if they accepted black members, then that helped grow their numbers.
Yep.
Maybe I'm being a little too critical there. I don't know. Maybe they did have a good heart, and if that's the case, that's a beautiful thing, and they've always been very accepting in that way. Jehovah's Witnesses are absolutely, they are absolutely. The Bible has has verses that it takes some apologetics to make it sound like the Bible is okay with homosexuality.
No kidding.
There's really, it's a difficult thing to get around. And you can ascribe it to, it was that place and time, or you can look up certain words and try to make it mean something a little bit different, but, whether in the Hebrew or the Greek, but it's not really easy to get around that. And the fact is that Jehovah's Witnesses, are kind of Bible literalists. I mean, they really take a lot of it fundamentally. And so they do actively preach against homosexuality.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
what happened in my cult.
Right. So it's very... some people will say Jehovah's Witnesses are not homophobic because they're not like, again, it's coming back to, loving the sin, hating the sin, loving the sinner, and trying to separate those two out. But it is very difficult at the same time when you have been taught to look down upon those people, or to look at them a certain way, to look at them as being worthy of eternal judgment by your God. It is very difficult to separate those two things out. And they really talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, especially. It's really ramped up as gay culture has been more and more widely accepted, which is a beautiful thing. I'll never forget the song by Macklemore, One Love, I think it is. That song, when it came out, really hit me hard, because I didn't want to hate gay people like I had kind of roundaboutly been taught to do. That song really impacted me. I love that song. And I just remember, though, I think there are so many people, though, that while they may claim, well, we're not homophobic, it's just, the Bible happens to say this thing. Yes, you are absolutely homophobic.
Well, there are lots of ways to couch your beliefs so that they don't sound as bad as they are.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think in systems like the cult, and it sounds like in Jehovah's Witness, you're taught all of them.
Yes, absolutely. There's so many tricks we had to perform on our own mind to get around things.
Well, it's loving to judge people. Like, don't forget that. You're being loving, and if you don't judge them, you're not loving them.
Yes, we were taught that shunning was loving. It's loving because you'll make them feel bad, and they'll come back to the only one true path to salvation. You have
to tell them the truth, the whole truth, and if they don't like it, that's their fault, but maybe they'll look back in the future and, they were right. And that's you saving them.
Right. And these ingrained thoughts and feelings of people they don't die easily,
No, they
and it's
don't.
tough for people. And I just think it's um, something that needs to be said is that when we see somebody that is trying to do the right thing, when they're trying to get over this stuff,
Yeah,
we do have to be patient with them, because these things, they're ingrained from the time that people sometimes, from their formative years, from the time that they're children. And
yeah.
it's not easy just to, you can change the way you think, but the way you feel a lot of times lags behind.
That's been the really big thing that I've noticed is
Yeah.
the real like disconnect between mental belief
Yeah.
and then the rest of it. Because there's a lot of things that logically I can look at and think, okay, yes, that was wrong. I'm not there anymore. I'm safe. For example, I have pretty severe PTSD from the entire experience.
Sure, of course.
And logically, I can look and think, okay, I shouldn't be freaked out when someone just mentions the word sin. But emotionally, and like all those pathways in my brain, there's so many things that can trigger even a smell. Like you
Yeah.
have a flashback, and it's just like, logically, I understand this isn't the way that I feel. And logically, I know I am a grown woman who lives in my own house, who's in a different state from everyone else who's in the cult. First person not to be excommunicated who moved away. Like, I recognize that. But there's still this huge part of me, that little girl that was taught that you're constantly at risk for sinning, and if you sin and you don't repent in time, you're going to go to hell, and you have like all these rules and laws and things to follow. That becomes like literal pathways in our brain that take a really long time to fix.
Absolutely.
And I think that's been understanding that it's not, it takes a while has been helpful.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And I think that society at large needs to understand that. I think that
Yeah.
we have a culture right now that is super focused on certain things that are hurtful things, but culture has come a long way.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easy to focus on how far we have to go and not to appreciate how far we've come.
That's been a big thing for
Yeah.
me too, is like, it's hard to not feel, especially because, healing is linear,
Yeah.
and you can have moments that feel like in the beginning, but
Sure.
it's been helpful to remember that like I am a lot farther along than I used to be.
Yes.
But I think this idea in our culture that like mental health is not the same as physical health, and it's, your fault in some ways. I really got pretty injured when I was first coming out. I just got married. I just moved away from the state where the cult was. And I went to a doctor, like, I'm really depressed. I'm suicidal. I'm really scared. And she put me right on some really addictive meds and told me that as soon as if I just journaled my story and went to therapy for a month or two, I'd be fine.
Oh,
Which has not even slightly been my experience.
well, of course not.
But she set me up to think that like I'm broken if I don't get better fast enough.
Right.
And that is just, I think, comes down to not understanding mental health and how living in one experience for years and years and years really impacts your future. I mean, I like to liken it to, since we were so legalistic and so intense, that like it's kind of like in Finding Nemo, when the fish are in the fish tank. And they're in a tank, they have walls, they know every inch of that tank. And yes, they're very, very shut off and closed, but it's safe and it's known, and you know the dangers and you know the risks. And then you get out and you're in the open ocean and you have never been there before and you don't know what you're doing. And it's hard to not miss the safety of the rules, the fish tank, And so that for me coming out was really difficult. And suddenly not having everyone in my family tell me what to do, especially because I was the youngest girl and I was constantly told what to do by other people, how to be, what color to paint my nails.
Now
like,
you have responsibility for yourself,
and
and that's
it's
kind of
terrifying.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
you only eat one meal for your whole life, and then all of a sudden you're in front of a buffet and you don't know what to do, and it's scary. And then you have guilt because there's parts of you that do miss your negative coping skills and miss the laws of the cult and miss the way things were ordered, because as abusive and wrong as it was, you knew it. Like I
It was
knew
comfortable.
it. And that's all I'd ever known. And so coming out and, oh wow, I can drink alcohol now and I can kiss my boyfriend if I want. And all of this stuff was just really overwhelming. And it's taken a long time to process, and I still have a lot to go. But I think that that's an important thing when dealing with people who either are shunned or are coming out and maybe did shunning, is just recognizing that it takes a really long time to fix those broken places in your brain.
Yep.
And just give as much grace as you can, because you don't know everyone's story, you don't know what happened to them. And I really do believe that that old quote, that be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting their own battle, is very accurate.
Very true. Very true. So where did everybody end up? You don't have to address individuals. We don't have to know where each individual ended up, but I mean, it sounds like the cult kind of dissolved. Is that accurate? Okay.
It did dissolve in a lot of ways. Everyone in my family who's still living is either in the same town or within a couple hours. I'm the farthest away, and we're planning to move farther. So location-wise, that's what happened. But I think in a lot of ways, it's really interesting looking at how people have progressed belief-wise, because the three of us, my best friend and the single sister and me, we kind of came out quicker because we had partners or people in our life that we could trust that were outside of the cult.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the older girls and my mother remarried, and he became a Christian in the cult. So she didn't have any perspective. And
Sure.
Similarly with my sisters, who both married people who were in the cult. And I think that was a really big divide, and still is, I feel incredibly blessed to have my husband, who's been really patient and loving and supportive and helped me see things in a different light. And so that was a really big chasm for a while. And there were some really awful moments where, after the cult was quote unquote ended, and after we knew we were in a cult, they still acted the same way, specifically to me, like threatening me with excommunication for moving away, even when we were supposedly not practicing excommunication anymore. And just, it took a long time for everyone to realize how damaging the way that we talked to each other, the way we interacted, the way we told on each other, and there was a telephone game always being played. So my family has really struggled, especially because for so long we were forced to be really, really close to people. If you have only 14 people in the world you can trust,
True.
You get close.
Yeah.
But then when you realize that you have a whole world of people out there that you can trust, and that you can live differently, and you can move away and still love your family, it's been really complicated. And in a lot of ways, I was one of the first people to start reaching out and unshunning people. I moved away. I was the first one to get therapy specific for the cult. I've done residential treatment. Like, I was kind of in the front, and that caused a lot of problems in my family, because as one of the youngest, for me to be going ahead was pretty abnormal.
Yeah, you
and
just
problematic.
completely flipped the family roles, the family
Yes,
script.
yes. And there was one moment specifically where, after we decided that we were in a cult and we're trying to come out of that, I tried to act like we weren't in a cult, and my entire family sided against me, told me I was evil, told me I was going to hell. And that was horrifying, because I thought that we were all on the same page, and we really weren't. And it was a really awful thing, because it was my oldest sister just not being able to come to terms with the fact that we weren't in the cult anymore, and there wasn't a power structure and all this stuff. But that for me was a really important turning point, because I began to realize that I could be autonomous. My family wasn't always right, and I have the ability to make choices on my own, and make pretty damn good choices.
Wow, good for
by
you.
myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was an awful way to get there. And it really
Yeah.
kicked off my PTSD and a lot of issues I have with my family. And there are a lot of things I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to really talk out, especially with my two older sisters. I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to be like, you really fucked me up. And I get that you were a kid in the cult too, but I have acknowledged what I've done and I need that from you. And I don't think that's ever going to happen, but that's what no send
Yeah.
letters are for. Is,
You say
write
no
out these.
send letters?
Yeah.
The
Have
what?
you heard of
Oh, I know what you're
so
talking about. Where you write something out. It's more. It's really for you. You're writing it to
it's
the other
just
person, but it's a way
exactly.
of getting things out. Yeah.
Well, and it's a way of getting things out helpfully. Because at this point,
Yes.
me going to my sisters and being like, you messed me up, I don't think that would be helpful for them or
Oh
their
no.
recovery.
And
But for me,
you can't get water out of a dry well. If that
well,
person doesn't have it to offer right now, if they're not in that space, you're not going
yeah.
to be able to get it.
Well, and the thing is too is that we're all in different places. I mean, my
Right.
one sister still the cult leader lives in her basement. I mean, he's literally in her basement.
And he still
And
has the same beliefs himself, I
yeah, and
assume.
he basically has shunned everyone, so he lives as a recluse, except for his brother. So he doesn't ever talk to my sister, even though they share a house.
Does he
Um,
still run the website and such?
no, so he never learned how to do any of that stuff. We did it all. So he can't do anything, which is actually kind of awesome if you think about it.
So basically, his poison is now contained to a basement.
Which is wonderful. Yes.
Yes.
The only times it threatens to get out is when he has some weird new scheme. He thinks he's an amazing artist. He's really anyway. He is when his brother decides to like see if maybe they can get his work out there. But fortunately, my sister's husband, which is the cult leader's nephew, he's kind of starting to take over the role from his dad, as like running the family business and doing other things. And so he's kind of able to keep a really good lid on the cult leader that lives in his basement. So
Wow. And how old is the cult leader now?
let's see, he's going to be 70 this year.
Gotcha.
So yeah,
Well,
just a couple months. So yeah, so it's just a very interesting situation, and it's been really complicated, and there have been a lot of hurt feelings.
well,
and,
yeah.
and a lot of stuff that's had to come out and
Wow.
get put back. And we, I think, are all slowly starting to be able to really give each other grace, but that took a really long time. And then because we believe that moving away from the city where the cult was evil, there was a lot of feelings about that, especially because I not only moved away from the city, but from the state. And so that caused a lot of problems. And then we're planning to move even farther away, which is still problematic for people. It's been a really interesting thing watching people slowly catch up. Like one sister especially, we were really anti-alcohol and anti, all the fun stuff. And it was really interesting watching her be really judgmental of those of us who decided to drink, and now just being like, I love it. It's great. Like, not to a problematic, but like I can have a grapefruit shandy if I want or whatever. It's been really interesting watching people come out and slowly like find their place. And it's been neat too, is that a lot of my family found a Christian church that they could go to, but they were almost all in different churches. And I really appreciated that because it meant that we were finally at a place where we could make our own decisions.
Right.
And
You're
that was one of the
individuating.
biggest
Yeah.
moments. And that was a while ago, of just looking and like, okay, one sister doesn't want to go to church. That's great. This sister goes to this church, and this sister goes to that church, and my mom goes to another church. And so watching people slowly find their own beliefs has been pretty wonderful. And especially once everyone got in therapy, that made a big difference.
So literally then, is everyone in therapy?
Yes, the one who's
that's
hasn't
awesome.
been is my little brother, but he's starting to go soon, which has been wonderful. He, I think, had the roughest go of it, being the youngest, the lowest on the totem pole, being excommunicated at 17. I mean, such a young kid. Really looking back, he shouldn't have been shunned. He was just being a 17-year-old. Like literally, that's all he did to get kicked out.
And so, and he too, he wasn't there for the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, the cult leader got so crazy that I think, especially for me, it was easier to realize that that it was wrong. But for him, um, he was on the outside looking in, and he still, for years and years afterwards, believed that we did right by him, that kicking him out was good for him. Like, the poor guy.
Oh, there are witnesses who leave, who are excommunicated or shunned, disfellowshipped for, usually a behavioral issue, and
Yeah.
decades will go by and they still believe that the witnesses have the truth.
Yeah.
And they've never really looked at the doctrines or anything, and they just feel like they're terrible people.
Yeah.
And they carry this shame with them. And I'm so glad that your brother is going to get some therapy, because it was never his fault, and
No, it
was a
wasn't.
messed up situation. And I feel for anybody who carries that burden around for so long, because it's just such a harmful place to be, and it's so not fair to themselves.
It's so harmful.
Yeah.
He was never equipped to be on his own.
No.
It's been interesting though, since we were really close and we have a lot of the same memories. And because of the cult beliefs, one person's totally right, one person's totally wrong, we both were told a lot growing up that our memories were made up or didn't happen, that I especially was told that I was an exaggerator and a liar and all these things. And my little brother really internalized that. I did too, but he especially, because he got kicked out for that.
Yeah.
And then he was living away from the family. It's taken him a really long time to realize, like, to be able to differentiate the cult voices in his head. And by voices, I don't mean like schizophrenic voices. I just mean the thoughts and the impulses, the programming from who he is. And it's only just been recently, especially because pretty much all of us have either been suicidal, attempted suicide, or committed suicide, all my siblings.
Sure.
And that the belief system that we have about ourselves and about that, the world will be better off without us, and we're self-willed and all these things, has been so detrimental. So seeing him finally come from that place to like being willing to get help has been just wonderful. And I'm really hoping he finds a therapist that really helps him, because I have been fortunate to find some really good people.
And you have to go into it knowing that not every therapist is going to be good for you.
Oh yeah.
It doesn't necessarily even mean they're a terrible, therapist or terrible person. It's just not a good fit. So you can't put too much pressure on the fit of each therapist. If they don't fit, that's fine.
They don't fit.
You're paying them, so just pay somebody else. Move on.
Well, that was the funniest thing about my family is my mom, she's like, I don't feel like I'm learning anything from my therapist. Like, he's not giving me all this good input. And I was like, Mom, you're not getting another cult leader. That's not the point of a therapist.
Right.
Like, it was
that's
so
an amazing
funny watching
point.
my mom.
Yeah.
Is she expected, and I think a lot of us did too, is that like, okay, we had to refill the cult leader slot. So that's why my sister stepped in, and then like a therapist stepped in. And I know for us too, because of the judgmentalness, and we also had these rules about like my mom, because she'd been so hurt her whole life and lost so many people, she like, if people weren't, say you had a friend and you had to text them first a couple times, if it was over 3 times, they didn't care about you, and so you should just cut them off. And so like these crazy rules that just came out of fear have impacted so much, like from a therapist and deciding you hate your therapist and then not going to therapy ever again, or like trying meds and the meds don't work, so you shun meds. And like there's just so many ways that this like all or nothing idea really impacts and devastates people.
Sure. So then we've talked about a lot of the negative impacts. What are you looking forward to in your new life? I know you've got this move that's coming up, and you're happily married. And how long have you been out, like kind of officially?
Officially, I've been out for 2 years.
2 years, okay.
So, that's when I count it.
Got it. Yeah. So then, what are the happy moments so far? What has already changed that you're excited about? And then, kind of paint a picture for us. Where do you want to go in the future?
There's a lot of things I want to do. Some of the really simple things that have made me the most happy were being able to read and watch things that I wasn't before. Like, for example, the first time I read Harry Potter changed my life
Oh,
because I
that's
wasn't
awesome.
allowed to read it growing up.
Yeah, yeah.
And I identify so much with, especially Neville, Luna, and Dobby as who I am. And Dobby was one of the people that I was able to use. If you're familiar with the story,
Nope, I've
he's a
watched 2 movies.
well, Dobby
I'm
is a
way
house
behind.
elf,
Yes, I
and the
know who
house
he
elves
is.
end up having to, they basically punish themselves if they speak anything bad against their family.
Uh,
And so throughout the story, we see Dobby, he hits his head against the wall when he says something bad about the
yeah.
evil family. And I just was like, that is exactly how I was.
Wow.
And recognizing that a lot of my behaviors were punishment urges and seeing that in Dobby really helped. So that like simple joy of like, I read Harry Potter and now I can be a Potterhead. Like that's been just amazing for me. It's also been really cool to recognize that the world is open to me. I don't have to do, I don't have to have a mission or do anything big. I can just be a human. I can be
Yeah.
here, and I am looking forward to, we want to get some land and have a little bit of a homestead, and that's possible because we can move away from the really expensive area that we live in. And before we couldn't. And if I had stayed in the city I was born in, I don't think I'd ever be able to buy anything because it's a very expensive place to live. Um, and so that, just like little things like that, like realizing I have freedom. And I also, one of the earliest times I realized I did was my family really disliked my now husband when we were dating, largely because he knew what he believed and he wouldn't
Mhm.
listen to them. And he was kind but firm as far as like, you guys are crazy. um, and one of the first things I ever did to really defy my family was I didn't break up with him when they told me to. They tried to get me to break up with him 3 times and once by text message. And I just remember thinking, I cannot lose another person. I cannot shun another person unless I have really good reason. And that choice was the beginning of me being able to make choices on my own. And that's been one of the best things about being out is if I want to wear a certain dress, I can wear it. If I want to have blue toenails, I can do it. Like I don't have people telling me what to do and where to go and what job to take. And obviously, I am married, so it's not like I'm like, screw you, I'm going to do everything on my own, but it's still, there's just so much freedom in being able to make your own choices and able to decide that what's best for your new family is to move across the country or so that's been
Absolutely.
just wonderful. And then the other thing, I have loved art my whole life, and it really got poisoned for me in the cult because the cult leader only admired things that were like him, and my style of art was not like his. I'm much more, it's called an intuitive painting and abstract art. I really enjoy that. Or I'm kind of cartoony, and I've always been that way. And I, in fact, stopped doing art for years and years because he would laugh at me and call me out in front of everybody and say how awful my art was, which is really painful when you're a teenager and
Yeah, that's
art
a
is like,
personal thing.
yeah, yeah. So one of the best things that I did for myself after I realized that my uncle wasn't the kind, wonderful person I thought he was I pulled out my paints and I started painting, and I haven't stopped since. I have an Etsy shop now, and I just paint to paint, and it's really a huge gift to realize that I can write my story and tell my story and paint my story, and I don't have to worry about putting people in my life in a certain light or doing it in a certain style. And just that freedom that has come has been so wonderful. And so, I look forward to the future as I continue to heal and continue to get better from, processing trauma and going to therapy and continue finding the meds that work for my OCD and stuff. And I really look forward to a life that I can create and my husband and I can create together that works for us and that doesn't have to fit a certain mold. And, if I want to go back to school and get a degree, I can do that. And if I want to, um, write a book, which I do, I can do that too. And it doesn't have to be exactly what everyone thinks it should be. And that's been, I think, one of the the wonderful pieces of this whole business has been realizing that I have autonomy and I have choice. And while that's terrifying, it's also really exhilarating in a lot of ways.
Wow. I think that is the perfect way to end your story. That is beautiful.
All right. Yay.
I want to thank V for being so honest and open about her life and the family cult that she was in. Sometimes out of something ugly can something beautiful come. And it seems like V has found the beauty in herself, in life, and in others as well. If you'd like to send a message of support to V, you can do so by going to shunpodcast.com where you can leave a comment for her. You can also find the resources that were mentioned in the episode there and the video for the song that she chose to represent her journey. V chose the song Come Thou Fount to represent her journey. In the email where she told me that she wanted to pick the song, she said, and I quote, "The song that was picked was Come Thou Fount. We used to change the words to make them fit our doctrine of conditional salvation. We took the most issue with the verse, Bind my wandering heart to thee. When I was dating my husband, we had a long argument about it. It was one of the first things that got me to see that what we believed wasn't biblical. And the first time I sang that full song in a room full of Christians who believe in grace and love and acceptance was one of the most poignant moments in my life. It's such a privilege to love without conditions and give grace and to recognize that we wander and mess up." I think that's something we can all learn from. We can all learn from that sentiment. All right, so that's not only the only place that you can leave a comment for her on the episode. As I said before, we also have a Facebook group called Shun Podcast, where we have people discussing episodes and their own lives. And I try to do things to encourage members to find good things in their life and to grow. As I stated earlier, I want to give you some highlights of the past month, just to give you an idea of the supportive group that's forming. Every Wednesday, we post things that we're happy about in life this week, things that are going good on Wednesday. Every weekend, we post things that we're doing for ourselves as part of self-care, something that we were never really taught to do in these cults. This month, we've had a couple that were served papers to attend judicial hearings to be disfellowshipped. We also had someone disassociate, and we celebrated with him. We had a watch party for the Leah Remini special on Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know if you got to see that or not, but if you have not seen the special, Leah Remini and Scientology, where they cover Jehovah's Witnesses, that is a must watch. Whether you were one of Jehovah's Witnesses or not, that special was so well done and relatable for just about anyone to learn more. We also celebrated Thanksgiving together a little bit. We kind of talked about what we were doing there. We're showing off our Christmas decor, and I even started a Secret Santa gift exchange for the group. So things are happening in there, and my goal is to keep it more about us as individuals, our stories, supporting one another, not just keeping up with the latest J-Dub stuff or memes or whatever, but this is about us, and it's a place for us to heal, to explore the things that have happened to us or how they might be impacting us even today, and to encourage one another to live better lives. You can also find the podcast on YouTube under the channel Shun Podcast, one word, on Instagram at Shun Podcast, one word, and on Twitter at Shun Podcast, also one word. If you'd like to hear my story and great insight into how the cult of Jehovah's Witnesses works, you can do so at the podcast called This JW Life, also found at thisjwlife.com. We haven't had any new Patreon supporters for a few months, but I want to take the time to thank the people that really helped me to make this show possible by helping to support it financially. Seriously, the show takes not just work and time, but there are costs involved in getting the audio hosted, the website, and doing transcripts and keeping the equipment going. You can support the show for as little as $1 a month, and it means the world to me to know that there are others in this with me. It's encouraging to see people who want to support what I'm doing here. You can do so at patreon.com/shunned if you're so inclined. Oh, and another great way to support both the Shun Podcast and This JW Life is to head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star review for them. It helps them to get found in the searches on there, and if more people can find them, then more people can find the help they need. Next month, we've got another former member of Jehovah's Witnesses named Jenny. We're going to talk about how a congregation reacts to sexual assault, mental illness in the cult, the fallout from a rough life in the cult and leaving it behind, and so much more. So we're going to close this episode out with the song No Hell Yet by Fair Voyeur. You can find a link to her song, to the Patreon page for the show, to resources that were mentioned and more, not just on the website, shunpodcast.com, but if you're listening on a podcast app, you can probably get all the information in the app by looking at the description. So as we end all episodes, love others, do no harm, and go be happy.
We'll curse God